Have you ever had to walk away from a toxic family member? No names, just yes or no.
I always knew my mother didn't love me the same way she loved my sister. But it's one thing to feel it quietly your whole life, through the glances, the subtle sighs, the way your birthday always seems to fall on a weekend she's not feeling well, and another thing entirely to hear it confirmed out loud, with a mouthful of chicken and a smile that didn't so much as flicker with shame. She said it while passing the mashed potatoes like she was commenting on the weather. You should just accept you'll never catch up to your sister. Just like that. No build-up. No warning. No pause. Like it was fact, like it was already universally agreed upon, and I just hadn't gotten the memo. I was cutting into a piece of overcooked roast when she said it, and my hand froze in midair. For a second, I genuinely thought I misheard. I looked up at her, then at Erin, who sat across the table in her perfect little cardigan, blinking in slow horror like she wasn't sure whether to pretend she didn't hear it or apologize for being the favorite. Typical Erin, caught between guilt and self-preservation. Always silent in the moments that mattered. I didn't react. Not really. I blinked. Swallowed. Put my fork down gently like I was at a goddamn tea party. My pulse was hammering, but my face stayed calm. Because after 42 years of this, you learn. You learn to absorb it like insulation. You learn to pretend your mother's words aren't darts, but dandelion fluff. And I think that's what scared her the most. I smiled. Not wide. Just enough to be unsettling. Just enough to let her know she'd finally said something that landed a little differently this time. You're probably right, I said, and I let it hang there just long enough before standing up and clearing my plate. I didn't finish dinner. I didn't touch the apple crumble Erin brought. I kissed Erin on the cheek on my way out and told Mom to have a good night. My voice was syrupy, pleasant, like I was complimenting her gardenias. She didn't ask why I was leaving early. She didn't follow me to the door. She thought she'd won. I drove home without turning on the radio. The silence was heavy but familiar. The kind of silence I'd grown used to during the 100,000 drives home from family events where I pretended to be okay. I parked in the driveway, sat in the car for a moment, and then walked into my house and went straight to the hall closet. I had to stand on a chair to reach the top shelf. I hadn't touched the old jewelry box in years, not since Dad died. It was covered in dust and wrapped in a dish towel like someone had tried to forget what was inside. I brought it down gently, not like it was fragile, but like what was inside might change everything. And it did. Inside the box were two things I never told anyone I kept, a cassette tape and a letter. Both were written in my father's handwriting. The letter I'd read before, but I hadn't had the stomach to revisit it in years. The tape, though, that was the wild card. I'd never listened to it. Not even once. I found it among his things after the funeral, back when I was still the only one cleaning out his side of the garage while Erin cried in Mom's arms and let me deal with all the dirty work. I always assumed it was some kind of audio journal. He had a habit of recording notes to himself. But something about the timing, the placement, the fact that it was hidden inside an envelope marked for Claire, only if you need it, I knew it was more than that. I put the tape on the table and stared at it. I didn't press play. Not yet. Instead, I read the letter again, slowly this time, letting every word drip into me like poison into a sponge. The handwriting was messy, rushed. My dad was a neat man, always precise, always structured. The mess of it told me more than the words did. He was scared when he wrote it. The contents are not something I'll repeat here, not yet. Because some things require build-up. Some truths need space to breathe before they suffocate everything else around them. But let's just say this, my father was not the man I thought he was. And my mother, well, she'd buried more than just old birthday cards and tax returns in that house. That night, I didn't sleep. I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, letting 42 years of resentment rise to the surface like oil in boiling water. Every snide comment, every backhanded compliment, every time I heard, "Why can't you be more like Erin?" in some form or another, it all came back, one heavy slap after another. And somehow, the pain felt different now. Not sharper. Not duller. Just heavier. Like it carried history I hadn't seen until now. By the time morning came, I wasn't tired. I was ready. Not for a confrontation. I'd played that game before and lost every round. No, I wanted something different now. I wanted clarity. I wanted truth. And maybe, just maybe, I wanted to pull the perfect little thread holding Aaron's perfect little world together and see what happened when it all came undone. I didn't do anything dramatic. Not yet. I simply sent Aaron a message. You should talk to Mom. Ask her about June of 1987. That's all. Nothing else. At exactly 10:36 a.m., I got a text back. Just one sentence. What did you do? Mom's completely shaken. Please call. I didn't. I just smiled. When you grow up always being compared to someone who glows under every light, even the unflattering ones, you learn how to make yourself small, smaller than the expectations, quieter than the praise that never comes your way, and more invisible than you ever intended to become. Erin wasn't just the firstborn. She was the golden blueprint, the yardstick by which all my failures were measured, the girl who never came home late, who baked cookies for church, who got into college early, married a man who wore pressed khakis on weekends, and managed to raise 3 kids who all seemed to say please and thank you like it was second nature. But what nobody really saw, what I think nobody wanted to see, was how much of that polish came from being handed the soft cloth of favor, of protection, of being held gently by a mother who bent over backward to keep her daughter's image intact, even when the edges frayed. Erin didn't respond immediately to my text, and for a while, the silence was more telling than any message she could have sent. It wasn't just delay, it was hesitation wrapped in confusion, like she had to parse the meaning behind my words, dig through years of curated memories to find what exactly I was pointing toward, and then calculate how much she was ready to admit to herself, let alone to me. And when she finally did text, asking me plainly what I had done to shake our mother so badly, I could almost hear the crack in her voice just from the punctuation. Erin, who never overreacted, who never demanded anything, who always replied with perfect timing and perfect restraint, was unraveling, and I had barely started. I waited another hour before calling her, not because I needed time to think, but because I wanted her to feel the weight of wondering, the same way I had felt every time I left one of those dinners wondering why I wasn't enough, what I had missed, what I had failed to do right. When she picked up, she didn't say hello, just breathed into the receiver like she'd been running, and for a brief, satisfying moment, I imagined her pacing in her spotless kitchen, phone clutched in her hand, face pale. The kids upstairs doing homework while she tried to make sense of a reality that was only just beginning to tilt. I didn't draw it out. I didn't monologue or dramatize or slip into cryptic vagueness the way Mom always did when she wanted to manipulate. I just said one thing slow, deliberate, without inflection. Ask her about June of 1987. There was silence on the line, the kind that isn't confusion but recognition, the kind that tells you someone already knows what you're talking about but has spent years convincing themselves they don't. And then she said it, so quietly I barely heard it. She told me it was a women's retreat. I laughed, not because it was funny, but because the absurdity of it was finally being exposed to the light. Did she? I said. Funny. Because Dad told me he found her crying in the garage 3 days after she came back, smelling like men's cologne and shaking so hard he thought she'd had a seizure. Erin didn't answer right away, and I let the silence stretch again. It had power now. I knew what I was doing wasn't fair in the traditional sense, and maybe not even kind, but it was just justified in a way only someone who's spent a lifetime biting their tongue while being compared to a curated lie could understand. This wasn't about punishing Erin, not really. She was a part of the performance, yes, but she'd also been used. Protected, yes, but manipulated in her own way. And now her halo was cracking, and I wasn't the one swinging the hammer. The truth was. Later that night, I got another text from her. Claire. What the hell was that supposed to mean? She wasn't panicking now, she was defensive, trying to regain footing, trying to draw a boundary. But I was already past the point of comfort. I replied with just one line, "You'll want to listen to the tape." She called immediately, her voice sharper, older somehow. What tape? I told her that after Dad died, I found something. I didn't say what. I didn't tell her I had read the letter again just last night and finally understood the hidden tone beneath the words, the way my father had written to me not as a daughter, but as a witness, someone who had seen enough and needed permission to stop pretending. I didn't tell her I had only listened to the tape once and that it had made me sit in the dark for 2 hours afterward without moving. I just told her she'd have it by tomorrow, and then I hung up. The next morning, I mailed it. Not a digital file. Not a cloud link. A physical tape, in a padded envelope, handwritten note inside, "Play this somewhere quiet. And alone." What happened next was a waiting game. And not the idle kind. It was the kind of wait where everything you've ever wondered might be true suddenly starts to crawl to the surface. The kind where someone else finally starts to question everything they were told was fact. And maybe, just maybe, the kind where the golden child realizes that her entire shine was lit by a lie. But that was her journey now. Mine had just begun. There's a strange sort of silence that comes the moment you know a secret is about to be uncovered, not the thrilling kind you see in movies, but the slow, heavy kind that settles over your chest like a wool blanket soaked in rain, pressing down with the weight of memory, tension, and the unbearable nearness of truth. That morning, after I mailed the tape, I didn't pace, I didn't panic, I didn't even check for a delivery confirmation, because I wasn't trying to control what Erin would hear or how she would feel once she did. I had released that weight, given her the match. And now she would decide whether to light it or pretend the fuse didn't exist. I drove, aimlessly at first, down the older parts of town, through neighborhoods we used to walk as kids when the world still felt wide and soft and unsorted. I passed the old rec center, where Erin learned ballet, and I spent most afternoons climbing trees out back, refusing to go inside because the instructor said I wasn't built for grace, a comment my mother had found amusing enough to retell at dinners for years after. I passed the Shell station where our father used to stop every Friday night for a pack of Camels and a scratch ticket, always hoping for that miracle win that would let him leave his job without fanfare and spend the rest of his life fishing by some lake in Oregon. A dream he never really chased, but spoke of often enough that it became folklore in our family, his only fantasy that wasn't ridiculed by Mom. Eventually, I found myself at the cemetery, parked under the dry shadow of a half-dead oak that rattled in the wind like it was whispering secrets no one had the nerve to speak aloud. I hadn't visited Dad's grave in over a year, not because I didn't miss him, but because I'd gotten tired of speaking into the ground, of pretending I'd get some kind of answer in return, of offering apologies or updates to a man who, for most of his life, had spoken in sighs and unfinished thoughts, always skirting the edge of confession, but never quite brave enough to land on it. But today I didn't come to talk. I came to listen, in a way that required no sound. I sat on the edge of the grass, the cold seeping through my jeans, and I thought about June of 1987, not just the lie, not just the 4-day retreat that wasn't a retreat at all, but everything around it, the air, the static in our home. The way Dad had started walking slower, like he was dragging something invisible behind him. That summer was heavy with heat and tension. I had been around 4 or 5, too young to understand details, but old enough to recognize when something was wrong. I remembered Mom slamming a door so hard a picture fell off the wall. I remembered Erin hugging me tighter than usual while we sat on the front porch eating popsicles that melted faster than we could keep up with. And I remembered, though I hadn't let myself really remember until recently, the smell of unfamiliar cologne on Mom's dress the day she returned, the way her eyes looked brighter, but not in the usual sense. She looked flushed with something. Not guilt. Not sorrow. Satisfaction, maybe. Or relief. Dad had never brought it up in words. But he didn't need to. He started spending more time in the garage, tinkering with things that didn't need fixing, oiling tools that barely got used. He bought a tape recorder, claimed he needed it for work even though he wasn't the kind of man who ever brought his job home. And years later, when I found that cassette and the letter tucked beneath a box of sockets, I knew, instinctively, that it wasn't meant for anyone else, not for Erin, not for Mom. Not even really for me unless I ever got desperate enough to search for answers instead of just shouldering pain. I remembered sitting on my bedroom floor last night, clutching the tape player I borrowed from the thrift store downtown because who the hell still has tape decks these days, and hitting play with a thumb that shook more than I wanted to admit. The voice that came out was slower, raspier than I remembered, like he'd waited until his final weeks to record it, when his body had already started to shrink around the cancer eating through him. But the voice was still his. Measured. Sad. Bracing. He started by saying he wasn't angry anymore, which hit me harder than if he'd started with rage. He said that sometimes, when you love someone, you learn to forgive things you wouldn't let slide from a stranger, and that forgiveness doesn't mean forgetting, it just means choosing peace over pride. But then, he said something that cut deep into everything I thought I understood. He said, I knew Erin wasn't mine the second I held her. Not because she didn't look like him, she did, enough that no one ever questioned it, but because there was a kind of ache inside him, a dissonance that never settled. He said Mom never admitted it, not directly, but there were hints, stories that didn't line up, dates that shifted, a moment when he found a letter in her drawer she never meant him to see signed J, folded neatly beside a photograph of a man he didn't recognize. He said he chose to raise her anyway, that he never told her, never told anyone, because to him, Erin was always worth it. But he said it broke something between him and Mom that never quite healed. That from that moment on, he knew he was second in her eyes, not just to Erin, but to a man who never stuck around long enough to claim what he left behind. He ended by saying, Claire, if you ever feel like you were the lesser one, remember this. I never doubted you were mine. Not for 1 second. I hadn't cried while listening, though my hands had gone cold and numb. I didn't sob or scream. I just sat there, blinking, staring out the window at nothing. Because grief has a funny way of circling back when you think it's long gone, tapping on your shoulder and whispering, you missed a spot. I stood up from the grave, brushed dirt from my jeans, and said nothing aloud. I just looked at the stone, etched with the same modesty Dad carried through his life, and nodded. Not in goodbye, but in recognition. In promise. Later that evening, Erin texted again. 2 messages. First, I listened to it. Second, Claire. This changes everything. I don't know what to think anymore. Are you okay? I stared at the screen for a long time. I thought about telling her that it didn't matter if I was okay. That okay was a word reserved for people who got answers when they needed them, not decades after the damage had settled like mold into the walls of our lives. But instead, I typed nothing. I turned the phone over and let the silence do the rest. Because the thing about June of 1987 is that it wasn't just the month everything shifted, it was the month a man decided to love someone who was never his, a woman chose herself over her family, and a little girl started learning how to disappear behind her sister's light. And now, all those years later, the truth was bleeding out, quiet and slow, but unstoppable. And no one, not even Golden Erin, could unhear it. There is a distinct kind of silence that falls over you once the truth has been spoken out loud, not just suspected or imagined or tiptoed around like a family heirloom no one dares dust, but fully and irrevocably released into the world, no longer contained by memory, denial, or polite dinner table smiles. It's not the quiet of peace, though from the outside it might look that way. It's a silence built from aftershocks, the kind that follows an earthquake when the ground has stopped shaking, but the air still hums with the memory of everything that just cracked. That's how the next day felt, like the space between tremors, like the moment when something has broken, but no one has yet agreed on what to call the damage. I didn't hear from Erin for nearly 24 hours after she listened to the tape, which, considering her usual speed of light responsiveness, told me more than any text or voicemail ever could. The envelope had arrived sometime mid-morning, overnight shipping with my note tucked just beneath the case, and while I imagined her hands shaking as she opened it, I also knew Erin well enough to guess she wouldn't listen to it right away. She would stall. She'd read the note 6 times, maybe more, trying to divine what I was really saying between the lines, trying to guess whether this was one of my episodes, as Mom used to call them when I had the audacity to express hurt, or something else entirely. Something grounded, unshakable, and unavoidable. Eventually, she would press play. And when she did, she would be alone, probably sitting at the kitchen counter where she reads her devotionals and plans the week's meals, or maybe in the laundry room, door shut, pretending to fold clothes while her reality collapsed in the background. I knew she wouldn't cry at first. Erin never cried easily. She'd listen straight through, stone-faced, trying to pick apart Dad's voice for weakness or exaggeration, trying to find flaws in the cadence so she could dismiss it as grief or paranoia or the desperation of a dying man. But she wouldn't find it. Because there was nothing on that tape but clarity. Dad's voice, low and rough, filled every inch of that space with a tenderness I hadn't heard from him in years. He spoke like a man unburdened, like someone who had carried a stone in his chest for too long and had finally pried it loose. He didn't accuse, didn't rage, didn't even try to paint himself as a victim, though God knows he could have. He simply laid it all out, how he discovered the truth not through confrontation but through quiet observation, how he chose to stay not because he was weak but because he couldn't bring himself to destroy something Erin never knew was built on a lie. He said he loved her. Not like a father who had no choice, but like a man who had made the choice every single day for over 30 years. And when he spoke about me, it was without ceremony, but with an intimacy I had never known until that moment, like he had always seen me, always understood, and had left this message behind not as an explanation, but as a rescue line. A way to pull me out from. Beneath the wreckage of our mother's favoritism. Erin didn't call. She didn't send a long text. Just one, hours after I imagined the tape had finished, Claire. I don't know what to think. I read it once and then again, slower the second time, realizing that her confusion wasn't just about Dad's confession, it was about the fact that the narrative she'd built her life on had holes. And that maybe she wasn't the daughter of two loving parents who sacrificed equally to build her pedestal, but the result of a compromise, a concession, an arrangement that started with love and ended in silent endurance. I didn't answer right away. Part of me wanted to reach across the chasm and soothe her, tell her she was still loved, still whole, still the sister I had shared a childhood with even if that childhood had always placed me in her shadow. But another part of me, the part that had sat quietly through years of belittlement and neglect, the part that had watched our mother rewrite history over and over with Erin as the protagonist and me as the afterthought, that part wasn't interested in comfort. That part wanted her to sit in it, to feel, really feel, what it was like to not have the ground beneath her feet be solid, to question whether the love she thought she earned had actually ever been real at all. Instead, I called our cousin Lizzie. Lizzie and I hadn't been close in years, not since the wedding when she caught the bouquet and I caught a migraine, but she had always been observant, always tuned in to the subtle currents of our family in ways others weren't. I told her everything. Not in a dramatic, breathless way, but slowly, methodically, as if I were unpacking a box I'd sealed shut 2 decades ago. She didn't interrupt. When I finished, there was a long pause, and then she said, "Claire, if this gets out, it'll tear your mother to pieces." And I said, "Good." It wasn't bitterness. It wasn't revenge for the sake of pain. It was justice, even if late, even if small, even if it only took the shape of a quiet truth spoken into the dark. Our mother, for all her curated perfection and biting commentary, had built an empire of silence and image, and for the first time, cracks were starting to show. She hadn't left the house since Erin brought up June of '87. She wasn't answering church calls. She skipped bridge club, which for her was practically a blood oath. She was rattled, and Erin had noticed. The next day, Erin texted again. This time, her tone had shifted. "What are you trying to do? What's the point of all this?" "She's a mess." And I stared at that message for a long time before replying. I'm not trying to do anything. I'm just done pretending. Because that's the thing about pretending. It works until it doesn't. Until the people you've trained to swallow lies without gagging suddenly decide they want to breathe clean air. Until the daughter you ignored long enough decides your silence no longer deserves her loyalty. Until the golden child hears the truth in a dead man's voice and realizes her crown came with a cost. Erin may not have understood it yet, but the shift was already in motion. The pedestal was shaking. The walls were thinning. The image was cracking. And neither of us could look away. It was Erin who reached out again, 3 days after the tape, 2 days after my last response. And 20-something hours after our mother finally emerged from whatever psychological bunker she had been hiding in since the ground beneath her legacy began to quake. The message was brief, almost clinical in its restraint, and carried none of the over-polished civility she usually smeared across her words like a layer of frosting hiding the cracks in a cake that had been left in the oven too long. "We're having dinner Sunday. Mom insists. Come if you want." That was it. No apologies, no explanations, no attempts to bridge the gaping canyon that had opened between us, and yet something in the flatness of those 10 words told me more than a heartfelt letter ever could. This wasn't a casual invitation, it was a test, or perhaps a final offering, or even just a ritualistic gathering at the edge of something that had finally, undeniably, reached its end. And, because part of me needed to see it finished, needed to stand there when the match finally reached the last thread of the fuse, I said yes without hesitation. The house smelled the same as always, that faint mix of lemon oil and overly boiled vegetables, a scent that clung to every corner like the history it carried, too familiar to be comforting, too heavy to be nostalgic. I stepped through the door and was immediately met with the tight, almost imperceptible shift in air pressure that happens when people have been talking about you until the very second you arrive. Aaron was in the kitchen, stirring something with unnecessary force, lips drawn into a tight line, and Mom sat on the end of the couch with her legs crossed, just a bit too elegantly. Like she was trying to stage manage the image of herself before it shattered completely. The table had been set for 3, not 4, and that small omission didn't escape me. There was no place set for the memory of Dad, no fourth fork, no toast in his honor, not even a mention of him in the tense exchanges that followed over salad and roast, as if erasing his ghost might also erase what he had revealed. The dinner was quiet, unnaturally so, with clinking utensils and forced chewing filling the space that used to be taken up by Mom's critiques or Erin's polished stories about her kids' piano recitals and gluten allergies. For a while, no one said anything of substance. We talked about traffic, about weather, about the rising cost of milk and the grocery store remodeling. It was all so offensively mundane that I nearly laughed, because I knew what was coming, and I could feel it rising beneath the surface like steam in a cracked pipe, inevitable, burning, uncontainable. It was Mom who broke first, though she'd probably convinced herself she was taking control. She set down her glass of wine, which she never drank more than half of, and looked at me with that same performative calm she had worn the night of the roast chicken incident, the one that seemed to say, "I've been here longer than you, and I will outlast you." Her voice was steady, but her eyes looked older now, almost sunken beneath the weight of something she could no longer reframe or deny. "You had no right to drag the past into this house, Claire," she said, each word pressed between her teeth like she was holding back something more dangerous underneath. "Some things are buried for a reason." I didn't flinch. I didn't raise my voice or throw my napkin or storm out, because I wasn't a child anymore, and I wasn't afraid of her authority, an authority that had always been built on a foundation of selective truths and revisionist history. I folded my hands on the table, calm as stone, and said, "You didn't bury the past. You just lied about it." Erin shifted in her chair. Not enough to interrupt, but enough to signal that she wasn't ready for what was happening, wasn't prepared to look either of us in the eye now that the illusion had been stripped down to its bones. And when Mom didn't respond, didn't immediately snap back or redirect the conversation with a clever insult or a passive-aggressive dig, I knew she had nothing left. No tools. No weapons. No narrative strong enough to stitch back the hole in her authority that the tape had torn open. She stared at me, and for a brief second, I saw something almost like sorrow pass across her face, not guilt, not apology, just the haunted recognition that something had been lost, and there was no getting it back. "You finally got what you wanted, didn't you?" she said quietly, the words not angry but hollow. "You always wanted to be the one in control." I didn't answer her right away, because that wasn't the truth. I never wanted control, I wanted recognition. I wanted truth. I wanted, just once, to be seen without being compared, to be heard without being corrected, to be loved without being told I had to earn it. And now that I finally had all the facts, now that the scales had tilted and the truth had toppled the carefully constructed mythology of our family, I didn't feel powerful. I just felt done. "No," I said finally, my voice softer than I expected. "I just stopped pretending." We finished dinner in near silence, the occasional scrape of silverware breaking the stillness. Erin barely ate. Mom pushed peas around her plate like she was buying time. And I sat there, watching the remnants of our family dissolve in real time, knowing there was no going back. No reheating this meal. No stitching up the cracks. When it was over, I stood, grabbed my coat, and walked to the door without being asked to stay longer. I didn't say goodbye. I didn't ask for hugs or explanations. I didn't even look back to see if they were watching me leave. In the car, I sat for a few moments in silence, the kind that didn't feel heavy this time, but clean, empty in a way that felt earned. I pulled out my phone. There was one new message from Erin. I knew it would come, I just hadn't known when. I opened it slowly, already imagining the tone, already bracing for whatever it might say. I need to know. Did Dad love me? I stared at those 7 words, each one weighted with more than she probably knew how to say, and for a moment, I considered crafting a careful response, something soft but honest, something that would hold her together without letting her off the hook. But instead, I did something I didn't expect. I deleted the message without replying. Because some questions don't deserve answers until the person asking them is ready to hear the truth, not just out of curiosity, not just to soothe themselves, but to actually live with what it means. I started the car and drove away, not fast, not dramatically, just forward, finally, for once, in a direction that belonged entirely to me. And behind me, the house, the tape, the lies, and everything I never said remained in the rearview, fading into the dusk.